Because one thing I've learned is this, in politics and in combat, cowardice is contagious, but so is courage. And if you're willing to be the first person over those ramparts, you will be shocked at how many people will come with you. I'm asking you to come with me. I'm asking you to be a part of the generation that will restore the promise of this country and breathe new life into it.
Hi, this is Making the Argument with Nick Freitas, and today we're continuing along our series. We're going to be talking about taxes and regulations. This is kind of the second part of a two-part series. Last week we talked about the economy and kind of economic principles in general, and we talked a little bit about free market principles and how they work as opposed to central planning that you would see through socialist or more fascist economic policy. Again, I don't think there's any doubt that free market economics works best, right? There's this idea that something out there must work perfectly. Well, nothing works perfectly because we're people and people make mistakes. But the free market puts the most emphasis on providing products and services that you want. And the key component of the free market is actually not competition. Remember, it's cooperation. It's working in voluntary cooperation with other people in order to achieve your objectives. And competition is naturally a part of that as well, which makes things better. But if you want to actually have access to good products, to services that meet your demands as the consumer, you got to have a free market economic system. If you push more toward the central planning of socialism, of fascist economic policy, of corporatism, mercantilism, whatever the different systems there that rely more on central planning, inevitably you get politicians and bureaucrats making the decisions about what's made, what's produced, what's provided, and ultimately they make those in accordance with political principles that work best for them as opposed to what works best for the consumer. So that really was the first series, is talking about the importance of the free market and explaining why it not only does a better job from an economic standpoint, but it also does a better job from a justice standpoint because it relies on peaceful cooperation instead of government or political coercion. Today we're going to talk about, okay, how do we use those free market principles and apply them through policy? And obviously, when you're talking about the economy and government's interaction with the economy, taxes and regulations are the two primary ways that the government interferes in the economy, oftentimes to the detriment of the population in general. Now, we all kind of agree that there are certain legitimate functions of government, and we all tend to agree that some taxes are necessary in order to be able to fulfill those obligations. But what are the most effective taxes in order to do that, the fairest taxes in order to do that, and always keeping to that principle that if we want the majority of the economic interaction to be taking place in the free market, in the private sector, well then obviously the more the government takes, the less interaction that can go on there. A lot of times you'll hear a debate about spending and specifically government spending. You know, again, the overall issue isn't necessarily spending or saving. The question is who's doing it. And again, in a free market system, free people working in voluntary cooperation get to spend their money the way they want. And that sends the appropriate signals to the economy, to the people that are developing products and services on what it is consumers really want. What do they want in order to make their lives better? So the more taxes the government takes, the more or the less resources there are available for the free market and the private sector to be able to do that. So what is the current status of U.S. tax code? And this is something that, you know, I've done research on it before, but I wanted to get kind of up to speed on what we're currently looking at with respect to the federal tax code. And some of the things that I learned just absolutely amaze me. First of all, we spend about 8.9 billion hours every year just complying with the tax code. 8.9 billion hours. I mean, I want you to think about that for a second. You think about all of the different things that could be produced, all of the different jobs that could be done, everything that could have been done in that time period with those 8.9 billion hours. But instead, people are spending that. They're not doing the productive labor that consumers want. They're just spending that time in order to just comply with taxes, right? Federal, state, local. I mean, that's absurd. That is so much productivity hours lost, right? And when you look at the overall composition of the tax code, in 1955, we had tax code that was maybe about 400,000 plus words long. Today, it's over 2.4 million. right? So that's where you start to see this huge shift from people engaging in productive labor based off of what their customers want in order to just fill out their taxes appropriately, right? We can't only look at it from the money that's taken from the economy. There's also the lost time. There's the lost productivity that it takes to fill out a complex tax code. In fact, if you look at the overall productivity loss in this country, it comes out to over $400 billion. That's $400 billion that was not used making cars or smartphones or food or providing for any number of other things that you want that make your life better. Nope, it was just there to comply with the tax code. I mean, to give you an idea, $400 billion is larger than the GDP of 36 different states in this country. That's how much time, that's how much money is being wasted just complying with the tax code. So what's the solution for this? Well, two things. One, we need to lower taxes because, like I said before, we want money to stay in the private sector where it's most productive and put to the best use, providing things that people actually want. The other thing we need to worry about is simplification, because obviously it should not take this long to fill out your taxes. So what are some of the best ways to do this? Well, I really like the idea of a fair tax. And a fair tax is often described as a consumption tax. Essentially, think of it as a sales tax. And so the idea would be that you would get rid of a lot of these other federal taxes or most of these other federal taxes, and you just have a federal sales tax. And the benefit of that is, obviously, the only time that you're paying that tax is when you're actually going out and engaging in commerce. And theoretically, you can make a decent argument that that's a fair way to collect taxes, because if you're using roads or if you're doing business with a company that's obviously relying on the police to provide some protection, on a court system to provide for contract law and things like that, well then now the taxes that you're paying are going directly toward those government services which allowed you or made it easier for you to be able to engage in commerce. Not to mention the fact that it's far easier to collect. Instead of sitting around at the end of the year spending hours, or in this case, millions of hours, filling out taxes, you just pay it whenever you buy the product. And the government collects it, and then the government is able to use that funds in order to provide those legitimate services that actually protect our overall country and our overall economic system. The problem with the fair tax, and I shouldn't say a problem, it's more of a challenge, is it would take an actual amendment to the Constitution. So the 16th Amendment to the Constitution allows the federal government to collect an income tax. Well, since the fair tax or the consumption tax is not technically an income tax, you would actually have to amend the Constitution. If you pass a fair tax, let's say that some politician gets in there and says, you know what, we're going to just, through Congress, we're going to get rid of these other taxes and we're going to set up the fair tax. That might sound really good, but the problem is that you still give the federal government the power to be able to levy that income tax, and we all know what will happen. You'll end up with a, quote, fair tax and the income tax and everything else the federal government has decided to levy against people. So it's really important that if we want to go for a fair tax, and I do think it's a good goal for both simplification and lowering taxes, we have to go through the constitutional amendment process. So at this stage, we need to continue to talk about it. We need to continue to advocate for it. But what are some of the things that we can do right now that would, again, lower taxes and provide for simplification? Well, Senator Rand Paul had a bill that was very good. It was a flat tax plan that he was putting forward when he was running for president. It's something that President Trump has supported lowering taxes, supported simplification of the tax plan, and that is definitely the direction we need to go. We need a system that both lowers and simplifies, right? And a flat tax is something that we could do within the current Constitution. We wouldn't need to amend the Constitution in order to implement that. And I think the quicker that we can get those flat taxes in place, combined with lowering them overall, the better off we're going to be. We also need to repeal certain taxes. There's any number of taxes that politicians will come forward and say, well, no, we're not taxing you, we're just taxing the rich, or we're just taxing a company. Here's what you need to understand about that. It's a lie. All taxes are paid by individuals, and all taxes have consequences beyond the initial person that's taxed. So if you're taxing a company, well, that's less money they have in order to invest. That's less money they have to expand operations. That's less money that they have to hire more people. So ultimately, the people that are paying the tax when you tax a company is not just the people that own the company. It's everyone that works for the company. It's everyone that has stock in the company. And inevitably, it's everyone that buys products or services through that company, because in order to comply with tax law and pay those taxes, they have to potentially raise prices. So it's important to understand that when politicians throw this idea out there that, well, you're just getting the benefit, but they're paying the taxes. No, believe me, you're paying it somehow as well. It's just several times removed. And so again, it's a trick that they play. So when we look at the overall tax structure, it needs to be about lowering, simplifying across the board. Right now, one of the greatest things that President Trump did during his first term was lowering the overall corporate taxes to put it more in line with our competition overseas. And you saw a lot of Democrats screaming about, oh, you're cutting taxes on corporations, but not people. Well, no, those people want the jobs. They want the products and services that the companies are actually providing. But if those companies have to pay such a high tax rate that it's easier to do business overseas, or they're not as competitive with overseas products, you've now put American businesses at a competitive disadvantage against our foreign competition. So by lowering those taxes, he made it easier to do business in the United States. And what did you see? You saw companies moving back to the United States. You saw foreign companies that wanted to move to the United States. And that's what we want in order to build a strong economy. This idea of using the tax code to punish productivity in order to help somebody else, you end up hurting both sides. What we need is a robust economy which allows people to keep more of what they earn, to invest more of what they earn. And so lowering things like taxes on companies, capital gains, things like that has a net benefit, not just for the investor, not just for the business owner, but for shareholders, for people with 401ks, and for anybody that wants to get a job or just have good access to products and services that they can afford. So let's go with the flat tax right now. Let's continue to push for the fair tax, and let's push for overall simplification so we're not wasting billions of dollars and billions of hours complying with a very, very complicated tax code. Right? And I think it's important to mention here that Abigail Spanberger, my opponent in the Virginia 7th District, and Joe Biden is advocating for $4 trillion in additional taxes. And again, he's playing this game where he's saying, no, I'm going to raise the taxes over here and you're just going to get the benefit. It doesn't work that way, right? We will all be hurt by this because more and more companies, people that are thinking about starting a business are not going to if they've got to pay so much in taxes that it's not profitable for them. People that have businesses right here are going to once again pick up and start to move overseas because they can't afford all the different rules and regulations and taxes that go into running a business here in the United States. Not to mention the fact that this is the same Joe Biden that is threatening another economic lockdown over COVID. If you do that, you're going to take businesses that are currently holding on by a thread and you're going to run them out of business. And that's going to be millions of jobs lost. So as we're going through this pandemic right now, and under any circumstances, you want lower taxes, you want more simplification. But especially under the current circumstances where businesses are not failing because they don't have customers, businesses are hurting because of government mandates and regulations during COVID and because it's just the nature of a pandemic, Joe Biden and Abigail Spanberger's solution is to raise their taxes. So you're already having a hard enough time paying the mortgage. You're already having a hard enough time making payroll. You're already having a hard enough time keeping your business where it needs to be to survive. And now the solution that Abigail Spanberger and Joe Biden want is to raise your taxes exponentially. That is absurd, right? So going forward, it's really important that we, again, focus on what truly makes the economy strong. It's free market principles. How do we have the government do the right things in order to foster that productivity and free market principles? You go in there, you lower taxes, you simplify, you make it easier for people to do business. And by the way, that also sends the message that you're now being rewarded the more productive you are. And that's the sort of incentive structure we want within our economy. I mean, obviously, you don't want a perverse structure where people are rewarded for not working. You want people rewarded for working. You want people rewarded for going out, finding that job, putting in the time and effort, building their skills, and moving up the economic ladder. Because one of the greatest things about the economy in the United States is that there is a lot of upward economic mobility. Something like 70% of the millionaires in this country are first generation. That means they didn't inherit their money. They had an idea and they were able to go out into the economy, take some risk, get some investors, provide jobs for people, and acquire wealth. That's a positive thing. It's not something that we should look at with greed or envy or malice, right? So that's what we want, an overall tax structure that is low taxes, easy to fill out, and creates the right incentive structures for people to produce and be productive and actually acquire wealth for themselves, for their families, not one that punishes them for doing all the right things. Now we're going to move into the second stage, and that's regulations. This is another area where it is just incredible the amount of lost productivity that we have for complying with legislation. So to give you an idea, every year the cost of complying with regulations in this country is about $1.9 trillion. That's with a T, not a B. $1.9 trillion. That equals out to about $15,000 per household in this country. Think about that for a second. Every time that government agency, every time that politician puts out a new regulation that they claim is going to help you, we need to see that through two different spectrums. One is, okay, does the regulation really help? Is it really achieving some sort of goal? Was it fairly written? Or was the regulation written by a big company that is trying to bar entry to the marketplace or make it harder for their competition to be able to compete with them, right? Because that right there is wrong in and of itself. To try to use regulations to push out your competition, which is not doing anything wrong, but maybe they're just better at providing the products and services. That creates this perverse incentive in the economy where now you don't succeed economically based off of how you serve your customer, you succeed based off of how good your lobbyists are. And that's one of the first problems with regulations. The other problem with regulations is understanding the actual effect of them. Because just because you pass a regulation doesn't mean the intention of the regulation is what's going to be met. So we have to be very, very careful on how we word them, and we need to actually be honest about the cost associated with them. For too long, politicians, especially Democrats, have gone forward and pushed regulation after regulation after regulation. And they've always done it saying it's going to make products safer, it's going to take care of workers, it's going to take care of laborers. Okay, well, fine, make that argument. But then we should also be able to look at the other side of it and say, okay, how much safer did you really make the product? Did you really protect laborers? I'll give you a perfect example of this. A lot of times we'll have politicians come forward and want to mandate things like unemployment insurance or mandate paid sick leave. And they look at that as, well, we're just doing a good thing for a laborer who, shouldn't come into work anyways while they're sick. And especially during COVID, that seems to make sense. The problem is that they're not actually taking into account the additional cost associated with that. So if you're a small mom and pop shop and now you're required to provide additional benefits, you have to do one of two things. You either have to pay your employees less because the government now has a mandate that you have to pay into, or you can't afford to hire them in the first place. So once again, it creates perverse incentives in the marketplace if we're not honest about how these regulations affect the overall economy. If regulations worked exactly the way politicians wanted them to, that would be one thing, but that's not reality. And unfortunately, we have too many politicians, to include Joe Biden and Abigail Spanberger, that don't seem to want to consider the adverse effects of some of the well-intentioned regulations that they put forward. I think the other thing that we need to see is how regulations carry the force of law. So within our political system, within the Constitution, the Congress and your state level, your state legislators, they are the lawmaking body within our government. But here's what ends up happening. Congress passes a law which is very broadly worded, and then they hand it off to an executive branch agency, a federal bureaucracy, and then they create the regulations to force you to comply with the law. So the Clean Air Act might be one bill that was passed, but then there's thousands of regulations that will now be put into effect as a result of the Clean Air Act. On average, you have about 18 regulations which carry the force of law for every one law that Congress actually passes. And we're starting to see the regulatory burden, the federal regulatory burden, is tens of thousands of pages. So once again, when you're thinking about doing a business, when you're thinking about adding onto your property, when you're thinking about building something or developing something, you got to go through tens of thousands of pages worth of regulations, federal, state, and local, in order to make sure that you're complying with everything. And a lot of times these regulations end up being contradictory, or one agency will interpret them one way, another agency will interpret them a different way. I remember as a member of the House of Delegates trying to help out a constituent who wanted to comply with the law. He wanted to create a business within a community that desperately needed it, that wanted the business there. And I remember watching as two agencies, I sat them right there on the same place, and I said, I want to know if this particular stream qualifies for credits. And one agency said yes, and one agency said no at practically the same time. That's ridiculous, and it holds up productivity. You're not making anyone safer. You're not making anyone better. You're just creating additional expense for someone that is actually trying to help their community. So, what is the solution for regulations? Well, there's a couple of things. There's a great bill called the Reins Act, right? And it's about basically putting the reins on the administrative state or the bureaucratic state, and essentially saying that, look, those of us in Congress, we're supposed to be the lawmakers. That doesn't mean your executive branch agencies can't help with explaining how that law is going to be implemented or what regulations would be necessary. But instead of just passing a broadly written law, handing it off to the executive branch and thousands of regulations being created as a result, they should have an opportunity to look at the law, write out the regulations, then come back and actually discuss with Congress before those regulations go into place so that lawmakers, your representatives, have an opportunity to decide whether or not that executive branch agency is actually implementing the law the way that was intended by the legislature. Because right now what happens is the bill gets passed, the regulations get written, everyone has to comply with it, we find all the mistakes, then we've got to go back and try to pass another law or amend it or come up with different corrections. Look, we should stop that right at its inception. So we look at the law, we go to the executive branch agencies, we give them an opportunity to develop regulations, then we have a collaborative discussion between Congress and the executive branch to say, okay, we don't like these regulations, or we don't want that implemented this way, or this fine is too high, or whatever it is, and then pass the bill in its entirety with the full knowledge of your elected representatives of how that law will be implemented by the executive branch. So the Reins Act, I think, is very important. It's a really, really good step in, once again, putting Congress back in charge of lawmaking and not allowing executive branch agencies to just kind of go wild on the regulatory side. The other thing that we need to do is something called the Red Tape Reduction Act. This is actually something that I worked on here in Virginia. In fact, Delegate Mike Webert was the chief patron for it. He did a phenomenal job, and we got it passed. And we got it passed with bipartisan support. And what the Red Tape Reduction Act does is that, and you can arrange it different ways, but essentially it says that, look, before you implement a new regulation, you need to go back and see if an existing regulation already covers this. You need to see if this new regulation is now going to make other regulations antiquated and get rid of them. And then you have an overall goal to cut the total number of regulations. Because let's face it, a lot of times these regulations go on a book from 50, 60, 100 years ago. They never get taken off, even though they're no longer relevant. And now this provides a mechanism where a business owner can get sued or fined or in a lot of trouble, not because they did anything wrong, but because they ran afoul of a antiquated regulation. And now for political purposes, somebody wants to go after them. So the Red Tape Reduction Act kind of changes the structure. It works hand in hand with the Reins Act. So it says, look, we want to look at the regulations as they go into place, but we also want the regulatory agencies kind of regulating themselves. Go back, look at what you have on the books. Let's see what we can get rid of. Let's make it easier to do business in the United States while we still have those basic protections in place, whether it's in order to protect the environment or whatever else. Again, it's not about getting rid of everything, but it is about significantly reducing them and not creating redundancies. So the Reins Act and the Red Tape Reduction Act are two things that I will fight very, very hard to get passed in Congress. So again, I want to thank you for joining us for this series on taxes and regulation, part of the two-part series with the economy, taxes and regulations. We're looking forward to, we have several more top issues that we're going to hit. We're going to be talking about healthcare pretty soon and what is a good solution for ensuring that everybody has access to quality, affordable healthcare. And spoiler alert, it's not more government control over the system. But as always, if you have more questions or you'd like to send us questions on anything that we're going to be talking about, please go to nick4va.com. You can go there. There'll be a tab for podcasts. You can look in there. You can see what our schedule is, submit questions to us, and we're always happy to answer those as part of our podcast. Once again, thank you for joining us. This has been Taxes and Regulation, and we're looking forward to seeing you next time.